Have you ever stopped to think about the immense power a few words on a screen can have? Just a handful of comments or a single post on social media, sometimes even just a few characters long, can completely alter the course of someone's life in a matter of hours. It's like we're watching a new kind of public trial unfold right before our eyes. This is cancel culture, a term that's become so common that we almost take it for granted. But what does it really mean? Where did it come from? And more importantly, what's it doing to us as a society? Now, this isn't just about bad behavior or calling someone out for a slip-up. It's about a whole system of judgment that's emerged and taken over social media and even mainstream media. At one time, the idea of holding people accountable, especially those in power, sounded like a form of justice. It gave a voice to the voiceless, to people who might not have been able to speak out against wrongdoing or discrimination otherwise. And let's be real, it can feel powerful, even liberating, to see people, particularly those with influence, finally answer for things they've done. But somewhere along the way, this movement for accountability has grown, and in some ways lost sight of its purpose. What started as a way to bring about change now seems to be taking on a life of its own, where one misstep, sometimes something as simple as an old tweet or an out-of-context remark, can lead to an onslaught of judgment, sometimes without room for explanation, understanding, or even forgiveness. I mean, we live in an age where it feels like every day someone new is canceled. Celebrities, politicians, companies, even ordinary people can become the target of mass criticism almost overnight. And the reactions we're seeing are intense. People lose their jobs, their reputations, sometimes even their sense of self. Families are affected. Friends are dragged into it. The consequences reach far beyond the internet and into real lives, often impacting people in ways that are hard to recover from. But is this really justice, or are we just creating a new kind of mob mentality? Are we solving problems, or are we just silencing voices that we don't want to hear? Cancel culture brings up some big questions. It makes us confront our own views on justice, forgiveness, and the power of collective judgment. Yeah. And in America, a country that prides itself on freedom of speech and individual rights, it forces us to ask, where do we draw the line? How do we balance the need to hold people accountable with the need to protect free speech, to allow for growth, and to acknowledge that people can change? I want us to think about this not just as a phenomenon, but as a reflection of who we're becoming as a society. Are we okay with this constant pressure to be perfect at all times? Are we okay with turning on each other in an instant without understanding the full story? Mm-hmm. And what happens to our culture, our connections, our ability to empathize with one another? If we continue down this path, are we growing stronger as a community, or are we losing a part of ourselves in the process? So today, let's talk about cancel culture in all its complexity. We'll look at where it came from, how it works, the good that it's done, and the harm it might be causing. We're going to dig into the stories, the arguments, and yes, the backlash, because I think deep down, all of us have some questions about this. Some of us are afraid of it, some of us support it, and some of us don't know what to make of it. But one thing is certain, cancel culture is here, and it's shaping us in ways we might not fully understand yet. All right, let's break down what cancel culture really is, because it's become one of those terms that everyone seems to throw around, but not everyone fully understands. So what are we actually talking about when we say cancel culture? Let's start by acknowledging that cancel culture didn't just appear out of thin air. It's got a history, purpose, and some pretty strong roots in the idea of social accountability. At its core, cancel culture is about calling someone out or even removing them from positions of influence when they've crossed certain lines or violated certain social standards. Think of it as a kind of collective decision by the public that says, hey, this behavior isn't okay, and we're not going to support it. And sure, in a perfect world, that sounds like a decent concept, right? Holding people accountable. especially those in positions of power or public influence. Sounds fair. Originally, it was almost like a tool of empowerment in a world where big corporations, celebrities, and people in power could often escape consequences because they had money, status, or influence. Cancel culture felt like a way for everyday people to step in and say, no, we're not letting this slide. It allowed voices that were often ignored or silenced to call attention to issues that truly mattered. For instance, when the Me Too movement came about, we saw people come forward with stories of abuse and harassment, and suddenly people who had gotten away with these things for years were facing real consequences. It was powerful, and in some ways, it was justice in action. Cancel culture gave people a platform, a way to speak out against things that were unjust and often hidden from public view. But here's where it gets complicated. While it started as this kind of grassroots movement to fight injustices, it didn't take long for cancel culture to evolve into something much bigger, much faster, and sometimes a lot harsher than it was ever intended to be. Today, it's not just a tool for bringing out serious issues or calling out genuine wrongdoing. Now it's like we've developed this hypersensitive radar for any mistake, any misstep, anything anyone says that could even slightly be interpreted as offensive, outdated, or controversial. It's almost as if the original purpose of holding people accountable for genuine harm has been overshadowed by this rush to cancel anyone who might have said the wrong thing at the wrong time. And what makes it even more intense is the speed and reach of social media. Think about it. In the past, if someone did or said something questionable, it might spread around their circle or even a city if it was newsworthy. But now with Twitter, Instagram, and all the other platforms, it takes minutes, sometimes seconds for a single comment, a joke, an old photo, or even an accidental slip up to be broadcast to millions. Suddenly, the whole world is watching, and that one moment, that one comment can become the focus of thousands, sometimes even millions of people. We're seeing situations where someone is canceled in real time, often without context, without room for explanation, and without any chance to learn or grow from the experience. This has led to a culture where people feel like they're walking on eggshells, constantly afraid that something they said years ago, maybe even something they don't fully remember, could come back and ruin their lives. It's no longer about learning from our mistakes. It's almost as if we're not allowed to make mistakes at all. And while some would argue that this makes us more cautious or woke, the reality is it's also creating an environment that's increasingly polarized, where we're quick to judge, quick to condemn, and not so quick to listen or understand. So cancel culture, in a sense, has become its own beast. What was once a tool for justice and awareness has, in many ways, turned into a form of social policing, where people are put on trial in the court of public opinion. And make no mistake, this court doesn't always play fair. It doesn't always give people a chance to explain, and it doesn't always care about the truth or the details. Sometimes all it takes is one person with a large following to call someone out, and that's it. The floodgates open, and the cancellation begins. And what's wild is that we're not just talking about major offenses here. Sometimes people are canceled over things that were socially acceptable a few years ago but aren't anymore because they simply hold a different viewpoint. We're in this strange place where instead of constructive criticism or dialogue, we're seeing a kind of social exile, a public shaming that doesn't leave room for learning, forgiveness, or, dare I say, redemption. So if you're wondering what exactly is cancel culture, it's all of this. It's a double-edged sword. On one hand, it's a way for people to fight back against those who do harm and get away with it. On the other, it's become this powerful, sometimes uncontrollable force that can destroy people's lives over a single tweet or a misunderstood comment. And I think it's fair to say that cancel culture has grown beyond what anyone could have predicted. It's not just about right and wrong. It's about the power we all wield when we band together online. And in this fast-paced, reaction-driven world, it's become both a tool of justice and sometimes a tool of destruction. All right? Let's take a closer look at how cancel culture actually works, because this whole thing doesn't just happen out of nowhere. There are specific ingredients, specific platforms, and forces at play that make cancel culture what it is today. It all starts with social media, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, all these places where people can instantly share their opinions with the world. Social media is the megaphone, the amplifier, and it's like gasoline on a fire when it comes to cancel culture. Think about it. Anyone, anywhere, can post something about anyone else, and it's right there out in the open for millions of people to see. With just a click, a tweet, or a comment, someone's entire life can be exposed, dissected, judged, and sometimes completely torn apart. That's a level of access to public opinion that we've never had before, and it changes everything. The speed is almost mind-blowing. In seconds, a single post or tweet can spread across the globe. It's shared, retweeted, commented on, and before you know it, there's a tidal wave of opinions, accusations, and judgments coming down on a person in question. And what's fascinating, and maybe a little scary, is that often it doesn't even matter if the information is fully accurate or taken out of context. People react first and ask questions later. It's this massive snowball effect where one comment leads to another, until it's almost impossible to stop. It's like a digital mob fueled by likes, shares, and retweets, gathering speed and power with each new person who joins in. And the more people pile on, the harder it becomes to see the truth clearly, because the noise, the outrage drowns out everything else. And that's not even the whole picture. Another huge part of how cancel culture works is the power of collective judgment. It's not just one person saying, hey, I don't agree with this. It's hundreds, thousands, sometimes millions of people all coming together to decide what's acceptable and what's not. And there's this strange kind of power in that. It's like, as a group, we're able to play judge, jury, and sometimes even executioner, deciding the fate of a person's career, their reputation, and in some cases, their personal life. This collective judgment can be incredibly strong because it taps into our desire to belong to something bigger, to stand up for what we believe in. It's a unifying force in a weird way, where people feel like they're fighting for a cause, for justice, for accountability. But here's where it gets tricky. This kind of collective judgment doesn't come with rules or regulations. There's no due process. It's just people, individuals with opinions, deciding what they think is right or wrong in that moment. And what's wild is that the consequences are often instant and far-reaching. Before there's even a chance for discussion, for context, for an apology, the damage can already be done. Brands drop partnerships, employers fire people, friends and family pull back, all because the pressure is on to make a decision fast. Social media doesn't wait for facts. It reacts to feelings, and once that reaction is out there, it's hard to take it back, even if new information comes to light. In many cases, it's like the internet has already made up its mind, and no amount of explaining or apologizing can undo the judgment that's been handed down. Then we've got the phenomenon of the pile on. This is when people start to join in, often without really knowing all the details or even caring to. It's just part of the culture now. If someone is being canceled, it's almost like an invitation for everyone to jump in, to add their 2 cents, to show they're on the right side of the issue. And the thing is, when you see thousands of other people calling someone out, there's this feeling that it's okay to do the same, that maybe you should join in too. There's a safety in numbers, a sense of righteousness that comes from being part of a larger movement, even if you don't know all the facts. It's almost like the outrage becomes contagious, and people just start piling on because it feels like the right thing to do in that moment. Cancel culture also thrives on the idea of receipts. the evidence, the screenshots, the old tweets, the videos, anything that can be dug up to prove a point. People are constantly digging into past posts, past statements, anything that can be used against someone in the present. And with the internet, nothing ever really disappears. It's all there, archived, saved, waiting to be brought back up when the moment is right. These receipts become proof, evidence that someone deserves to be canceled. And while sometimes they're valid and bring real issues to light, other times they're just pieces of the past taken out of context, used to fit a narrative or reinforce a judgment that's already been made. In a way, cancel culture works almost like a high-speed trial, but there's no room for defense, no room for nuance. It's judgment in real time, often based on snapshots of information. And once that judgment is out there, it sticks. It's hard for people to see beyond the narrative that's been created, and even harder for the person being canceled to change it. We're seeing people lose their jobs, their friends, their opportunities, sometimes over things they did years ago, sometimes over things that are blown way out of proportion. And there's no process for redemption, no clear path to say, I've learned from this, I've grown from this, I've grown from this, I've grown. It's just one mistake, one bad moment, and you're out. So when we talk about how cancel culture works, we're really talking about a system that's built on speed, emotion, and collective judgment. It's a system where social media plays the role of the judge, and we, the users, play the jury, deciding in real time who's good and who's bad. And because it happens so fast and with so much force, it leaves little room for understanding or forgiveness. It's the kind of thing that's both incredibly powerful and incredibly dangerous, because once that judgment is out there, it's almost impossible to take it back. It's like we're holding people to this impossible standard of perfection, forgetting that every one of us is human, every one of us makes mistakes. And yet cancel culture rolls on, picking up speed, becoming stronger, more decisive, and sometimes more unforgiving than ever. Now, here's the thing about cancel culture. It's not all black and white. There are some real positives that have come out of it, and it's important to acknowledge those. For one, cancel culture has been a powerful tool for social justice. It's brought light to issues that have been swept under the rug for years, maybe even decades. Think about the Me Too movement that was, in many ways, driven by the spirit of cancel culture. Collective calling out of people in positions of power who abused their influence and got away with it for too long. People who were once untouchable, protected by fame, wealth, or influence, finally had to answer for their actions. And that's huge. Before the internet, a lot of these voices, people who'd been silenced, marginalized, or overlooked, didn't have a platform to speak out. They didn't have a way to say, this happened to me and it's not okay. Cancel culture gave them that voice. It's like, for the first time, every day, people had a way to push back against those who misused their power, to demand accountability from those who thought they could act without consequence. Another positive aspect of cancel culture is that it's made us more aware as a society. It's forced us to confront issues that we might not have wanted to deal with otherwise. Racism, sexism, inequality, privilege, these aren't new problems, but they're problems that historically were often ignored or glossed over. But with cancel culture, these issues are being dragged out into the open, put under a microscope, and discussed in a way that's sometimes uncomfortable but necessary. People are being called out for behaviors or statements that, while they might have been acceptable in the past, aren't acceptable anymore. And that's part of progress, right? Society evolves, and what was okay 20 years ago might not be okay today. Cancel culture has forced us to question old norms and ask ourselves, is this still who we want to be? Are these the values we want to uphold? In a strange way, cancel culture is like a mirror reflecting back to us the things we need to work on as a society. And let's be honest, cancel culture has also encouraged people to think twice before they act, before they speak, before they post something that might be hurtful or offensive. It's created a kind of accountability that wasn't really there before. I mean, there was a time when people in power, celebrities, politicians could pretty much do or say anything without facing any real consequences. But now they have to be careful. They have to consider how their actions and words might impact others, because they know there's a public out there that's watching, ready to call them out if they cross the line. And honestly, that's not a bad thing. Accountability, when done right, can lead to real positive change. It can make people more mindful, more empathetic, more emphatic, more aware of how their actions affect others. It's like society's way of saying, hey, we're all in this together and we're going to hold each other to a certain standard. Cancel culture has also played a role in empowering communities that were historically marginalized or oppressed. For so long, certain voices, women, people of color, LGBTQ individuals, were sidelined, not taken seriously, or simply ignored. But cancel culture has given these communities a platform, a way to speak out and demand respect, to say enough is enough. It's leveled the playing field in a way, making it possible for people who were once silenced to finally be heard. And that's powerful. It's allowed for stories to be told that might otherwise never see the light of day. It's given people the courage to come forward, to stand up for themselves and for others, to hold people in power accountable. And in that sense, cancel culture has been a force for positive change. It's opened up conversations about issues that matter, issues that have real, lasting impacts on people's lives. But let's also acknowledge that cancel culture's positives aren't always straightforward. There's a fine line between accountability and outright condemnation. When done with intention and compassion, cancel culture can lead to healing, to growth, to a better understanding of one another. But when it's done recklessly, without consideration or context, it can be incredibly damaging. So yes, cancel culture has done some real good. It's shined a light on darkness, empowered people who felt voiceless, and held people who felt voiceless, and held people accountable in ways that were once unimaginable. It's forced us to look at ourselves, at our society, and ask some tough questions. But as we'll see, there's also a darker side, a side that can be unforgiving, relentless, and sometimes even toxic. So while we can appreciate the positive impact cancel culture has had, we also have to recognize the complexities, the nuances. It's a tool, a double-edged sword that can either cut through injustice, or if wielded without care, can cause a lot of harm. And that's what makes cancel culture so complicated. It's not just good or bad. It's both. It's a force that can bring about much needed change, but can also spiral out of control if we're not careful. And that's what we're here to talk about. The balance, the responsibility that comes with holding each other accountable. Because if we want cancel culture to truly serve us, to be a force for good, we have to understand both its power and its limitations. We have to remember that real accountability isn't just about punishment. It's about growth. It's about understanding. And maybe most importantly, it's about finding a way forward together. But here's where we hit the other side of cancel culture, the part that's harder to look at, harder to defend, and frankly, a bit unsettling. Because while cancel culture has definitely done some good, there's also a darker, more unforgiving side to it that we can't ignore. Cancel culture can be ruthless, relentless, and sometimes even cruel. In its rush to hold people accountable, it doesn't always leave room for nuance, for context, or for forgiveness. When you're canceled, it's not just a slap on the wrist or a call to rethink your actions. It can feel like being exiled, publicly shamed, and in some cases completely erased. And that's a powerful thing. It's like we've created this tool that can bring down anyone, anytime, and we're not always careful about how we use it. One of the biggest problems with cancel culture is that it doesn't really allow for mistakes. We're all human, right? We all say things we regret. We all have moments we're not proud of. But in the world of cancel culture, there's this expectation that you have to be perfect, that you have to have always had the right opinions, the right behavior, no matter how much time has passed or how much you've grown since then. It's as if we've lost sight of the fact that people can change, that they can learn and become better. And instead, we've started treating every misstep like it's a permanent reflection of who someone is. One wrong tweet, one bad joke, one out of context comment from years ago, and suddenly you're defined by that moment forever. There's no room for redemption, no space for growth. Swift, brutal. It's just judgment. Swift, brutal, and often final. Then there's the issue of context. So many times people get canceled over a single comment or a brief clip that gets shared without the full story. Maybe it was something they said in a different time under different circumstances. Maybe it was meant as a joke, or maybe it was taken out of context entirely. But once it's out there, once it's been labeled as offensive or problematic, it's like the full story doesn't matter anymore. People jump to conclusions. They make judgments, and the person in question doesn't even get a chance to explain themselves. It's like the court of public opinion is in session, but there's no defense, no opportunity for the person to clarify, provide context, and that's dangerous because it creates this environment where we're encouraged to judge quickly, harshly, and without all the facts. It's like we've forgotten how to give people the benefit of the doubt, how to listen or even just to pause and think before reacting. Cancel culture also has a way of making everything black and white. You're either good or you're bad. You're either right or you're wrong. But life isn't that simple. People aren't that simple. People aren't that simple. We're all complex with our own experiences, beliefs, and histories. And yet, cancel culture often doesn't leave room for that complexity. It's quick to label, to categorize, to decide who fits into what box. And once you're in that box, it's almost impossible to get out. You're either accepted by the crowd or you're pushed out, often permanently. And what's worse, the people who join in the canceling, they're not just disagreeing with you or criticizing you. In many cases, it becomes this whole campaign to ruin your life, to strip away your job, your relationships, your reputation. It's not just about calling out behavior. It's about erasing the person entirely. And that's a level of intensity that, let's be honest, is hard for anyone to endure. And let's talk about the pile-on effect, because that's a huge part of what makes cancel culture so powerful and in some ways so harmful. Once someone is being canceled, it's like an invitation for everyone to pile on. People start commenting, retweeting, sharing their outrage, and it spirals out of control. Often, people who don't even know the full story jump in, adding their voices to the chorus of criticism. It becomes less about the original issue and more about joining in on the outrage. It's almost as if cancel culture turns into a spectacle, something people want to be a part of, even if they don't fully understand what's happening. And that's when things start to get ugly. That's when you see threats, harassment, sometimes even violence. It stops being about accountability and starts being about punishment, about inflicting as much damage as possible. And the person on the receiving end, they're left to deal with the fallout, often alone, with no way to defend themselves or make amends. What's truly troubling is the way cancel culture has created an environment of fear. People are afraid to speak out, to share their opinions, to have real conversations. They're worried that one wrong word, one unpopular opinion could lead to them being canceled. And that fear doesn't just affect the people who get canceled. It affects everyone. It creates a chilling effect where people feel like they can't be themselves, where they're constantly second guessing every word, every action, every post. And when people are afraid to speak up, to make mistakes, to learn and grow, we lose something essential. We lose the diversity of thought, the freedom to explore new ideas, the ability to have open, honest conversations. Instead, we end up with a society where everyone is just trying to play it safe, to blend in, to avoid controversy. And that's not a healthy way to live. It's not a healthy way to grow as individuals or as a society. So, yes, cancel culture has a dark side. It can be unforgiving, merciless, and in some cases, downright cruel. It doesn't always leave room for growth or redemption. It doesn't always take context or complexity into account, and it creates a climate of fear, a culture where people are afraid to speak up, to make mistakes, to be human. And that's a real problem, because if we're not careful, cancel culture could end up doing as much harm as it does good. It could end up stifling the very conversations we need to be having, silencing the voices we need to hear, and creating a society that's more judgmental, more polarized, and less forgiving. And that's something we all need to think about. Because if cancel culture is going to be a tool for accountability, it needs to be balanced with compassion, with understanding, and with the recognition that we're all human, that we're all flawed, and that we're all flawed, and that we all deserve a chance to learn, to grow, and to make things right. Now, when it comes to cancel culture, one of the most complex aspects to navigate is the way it's viewed differently across the spectrum. In America, where we're so deeply committed to ideals like freedom of speech and individual rights, cancel culture hits a unique nerve. Some people see it as a necessary correction, a way to finally hold people accountable who for so long could get away with saying or doing just about anything without consequence. For others, it's a direct threat to freedom, form of modern censorship that prevents us from truly speaking our minds. And these opposing views don't just create disagreement. They create a serious tension in society that reflects some deep questions about who we are and where we're going. Because at its core, cancel culture forces us to confront how we want to live as a society. Do we want a world where there's a right way to think, a right set of opinions, and stepping outside of that results in immediate backlash? Or do we want to be a place where people can openly share ideas, challenge norms, and yes, even make mistakes without fear of being erased for it? For some, cancel culture is seen as a form of justice, a way for people to hold powerful figures accountable when traditional institutions might look the other way. In this view, it's about empowering the public, giving everyday people a voice to push back against those who misuse their influence. And there's something very American about that, right? Standing up to power, calling out those who abuse it, making sure that everyone, no matter how rich or famous, has to answer for their actions. There's a sense of fairness to it, a sense that cancel culture is the public's way of leveling the playing field. But on the flip side, there's the argument that cancel culture is less about fairness and more about silencing voices that don't fit the current narrative. For those who see it this way, cancel culture is a tool that stifles diversity of thought, where people who disagree with mainstream ideas are pressured into silence. And that fear that cancel culture is slowly eroding our freedom to express different views is something that's deeply unsettling to many Americans. Now, let's talk about the ripple effects of cancel culture across different areas of our lives, because it's not just something that affects celebrities and politicians. Cancel culture has started to make its way into the workplace, into classrooms, and even into friendships and family gatherings. People are nervous. They're careful about what they say at work, worried that one comment might get them canceled or even cost them their job. In classrooms, students and teachers alike are hesitant to discuss controversial topics, fearing that an honest conversation could be misinterpreted or used against them. And within families and friend circles, we're seeing a kind of self-censorship where people avoid certain topics altogether, choosing to tiptoe around each other rather than risk a disagreement that could lead to canceling someone close to them. It's almost as if cancel culture has crept into every corner of our lives, creating a kind of invisible boundary around what we can and can't say, what we can and can't think. And that's a powerful shift in our culture, one that's redefining what it means to be part of a community, what it means to be American. What's particularly interesting is how younger generations view cancel culture compared to older generations. Many young people today see it as a way to stand up for what they believe is right. They feel empowered to call out injustice, to fight for equality, to demand accountability in ways that older generations might not have had the chance to do. To them, cancel culture can feel like a form of activism, a way to push society forward and make sure that people who cause harm don't just get a pass. But older generations who might be more familiar with the idea of open debate and the exchange of differing opinions often see cancel culture as restrictive, as something that limits discussion instead of encouraging it. For them, it feels like a step backward, move away from the values of free speech and open dialogue that they grew up with. And this difference in perspective is creating a generational divide where younger and older Americans often find themselves at odds over what cancel culture represents and whether it's helping or hurting us as a society. There's also the question of whether cancel culture is really leading to meaningful change. Sure, it can get someone fired or removed from a project, but is that actually solving the problem or just pushing it out of sight? Are we using cancel culture as a shortcut to real accountability, substituting public shaming for genuine growth and understanding? Some people argue that true accountability takes time. It involves more than just calling someone out and moving on. It involves a process, a chance for the person to recognize their mistakes, to make amends, to learn and change. But cancel culture doesn't always allow for that. It's fast, it's decisive, and once you're canceled, the opportunity for redemption can feel out of reach. It's like we're forgetting that people are capable of growth, that they can learn from their mistakes. And in the process, we might be missing out on the real work of creating a society where people understand one another, where we can actually move forward together. And let's not ignore the fact that cancel culture, as powerful as it is, isn't always applied fairly. Sometimes it feels arbitrary, inconsistent, where certain people or groups seem to get canceled while others don't. There's this idea that if you say the wrong thing or hold the wrong opinion, you're done for. But if you're someone who aligns with popular views, you might get a pass. It's a double standard that can feel confusing and unfair, leaving people wondering, what are the rules here? And that inconsistency only adds to the feeling that anyone could be next, that there's no clear guideline for what's acceptable or not. It creates a climate of uncertainty where people feel like they're constantly walking a tightrope, one wrong step away from being canceled. So cancel culture isn't this simple thing we can label as good or bad. It's layered, it's complicated, and it brings up real questions about who we are as a society. On one hand, it's a tool for justice, for making sure people don't get away with harmful behavior. But on the other, it's a form of control, a way of silencing voices, of shaping what's acceptable to say and think. And in America, a place where we pride ourselves on freedom and individuality, that's a hard thing to wrestle with. Because if cancel culture continues to grow unchecked, we have to ask ourselves, are we really holding people accountable, or are we just shutting them down? Are we creating a culture of awareness and empathy, or are we creating one of fear and division? These are the kinds of questions we need to be asking, and we need to be asking them now, because cancel culture isn't just a trend. It's not something that's going to fade away on its own. It's reshaping how we interact, how we communicate, how we think about each other. And if we want it to be something that ultimately makes us better, we have to approach it with a sense of balance. We have to figure out how to use it responsibly, how to make room for accountability without losing our humanity, our ability to forgive, and our belief in the possibility of change. And that's a conversation that's worth having, one that hopefully can bring us together rather than push us further apart. All right, so here we are facing the question that lies at the heart of this entire conversation. where do we go from here with cancel culture? Because the reality is, cancel culture isn't going away. It's here to stay, and it's changing the way we live, the way we communicate, and the way we hold each other accountable. But if we're going to make it a force for good rather than a source of fear and division, we need to look at how to approach it responsibly, with empathy and a deeper understanding of what it means to really be canceled. It's not enough to just call people out and move on. We have to start thinking about what we're trying to accomplish, what kind of society we want to build, and whether cancel culture as it stands is truly helping us get there. Imagine if instead of instantly condemning someone for a mistake, we looked at it as an opportunity to educate, to have a conversation, to open up a dialogue. What if instead of canceling, we focused on what some people are now calling in? Where you invite someone to understand why their actions or words were hurtful instead of immediately pushing them out. This idea of calling in doesn't mean ignoring harmful behavior. It means addressing it with a goal of growth and understanding rather than punishment. It's about recognizing that people can learn and evolve, that change is possible, and that our knee-jerk reaction to shame or banish someone isn't always the best way to create a better society. If we approached cancel culture with a little more compassion, a little more patience, we might start to see real change, not just in individuals, but in the way we handle conflict and disagreement as a whole. And that brings us to forgiveness, a concept that feels almost foreign in today's cancel culture environment. But forgiveness doesn't mean excusing bad behavior. It means allowing room for someone to make amends, to show that they've learned to rebuild trust. Right now, cancel culture often skips over this step. It's like once you're canceled, there's no coming back, no matter how much you might try to make things right. But if we look at history, at all the ways people have been able to change, to grow, to become better versions of themselves, we realize that redemption is essential to human progress. Without forgiveness, without second chances, we're essentially saying that people are defined by their worst moments, and that's it. That's who they are forever. And that's just not realistic. It's not humane. We have to give people a path to redemption if we want cancel culture to be a tool that actually builds a better world rather than just tearing people down. Then there's the matter of context and intention. Not every mistake or misstep is equal, and not every offense should carry the same weight. We've seen situations where people have been canceled over things they said or did years ago in a different time with a different understanding of the world. Social norms change, language evolves, and people grow. If we're going to hold people accountable, we need to take into account the context of their actions, the intent behind their words, and whether they're willing to take responsibility and make things right. This doesn't mean giving people a free pass. Far from it. But it does mean recognizing that accountability isn't a one-size-fits-all approach. It means understanding that real accountability is about more than just pointing fingers and handing down judgments. It's about meeting people where they are and giving them a chance to move forward, to become part of the solution. And ultimately, I think we need to ask ourselves, what kind of culture do we want to create? Do we want to be a society that's so focused on punishing mistakes that we lose sight of the potential for growth? Or do we want to be a culture that values accountability? Yes, but also forgiveness, learning, and the possibility of change.
Imagine if cancel culture shifted from a tool of judgment to a pathway for personal growth.
Imagine if instead of just canceling people, we gave them the chance to learn, to understand, to do better. Imagine if we focused not just on calling people out, but on calling them in, giving them a real opportunity to see the impact of their actions and to make amends. That's the kind of cancel culture that could actually make a difference. That's the kind of cancel culture that would reflect the best of who we are, the best of what America stands for, a place where everyone has the chance to become better, to grow, to move forward. So as we wrap up this conversation, I want us to think about what cancel culture could be if we approached it with empathy, with compassion, with a commitment to true accountability. Cancel culture doesn't have to be a tool of destruction. It can be a tool of transformation. But for that to happen, we need to be willing to look beyond the surface, to go deeper, to ask ourselves, to go deeper, to ask ourselves tough questions about how we want to hold each other accountable. We need to remember that behind every tweet, every comment, every headline, there's a person, a human being, flawed and imperfect, just like every one of us. And if we can approach cancel culture with that in mind, if we can keep empathy at the center, maybe, just maybe, we can turn it into something that doesn't just tear people down, but lifts us all up. Because at the end of the day, accountability is important, growth is important, justice is important, but so is kindness. So is understanding. So is giving people the chance to make things right. And if we're going to live in a society where we're quick to hold each other to a high standard, let's also make sure we're giving each other the grace and the opportunity to meet that standard. Because that's what true progress looks like. Mm-hmm. That's what real change is about. And that's the kind of cancel culture we can all get behind. One that builds up rather than tears down, that unites rather than divides, and that ultimately brings out the best in all of us. So here we are at the end of this deep dive into cancel culture. And maybe you're left with more questions than answers, and that's okay. Cancel culture is complicated. It's messy. It's this massive force that's both empowered and silenced people, held wrongdoers accountable while sometimes going too far, lifting up justice in one moment and crushing compassion in the next. It's not black and white. It's full of gray areas, full of real human lives, real pain, real lessons. And I think that's what makes it such an important thing for us to think about, to question, to discuss, because cancel culture reflects so much about who we are, who we want to be, and the kind of society we're shaping with every comment, every like, every tweet. We started this conversation by looking at cancel culture as a tool for accountability, as a way for people to push back against those who've abused power, silenced others, or harmed the community. And there's real value in that. There's power in standing up and saying, this isn't okay. There's power in holding people responsible, especially when they've gone unchecked for too long. But somewhere along the way, cancel culture also became a tool for judgment, for shaming, for closing doors on people without room for context, growth, or redemption. And that's where it gets tough, because as humans, we're all flawed. We all make mistakes. We all have things in our past we're not proud of. And if we want a world where we can grow, we have to find a way to balance accountability with empathy, with understanding, with a belief in the possibility of change. So as we go forward, maybe the challenge is this: how do we keep cancel culture's best parts, the power to speak up, the drive for justice, the demand for accountability, while letting go of its most harmful tendencies? How do we use our voices to call for change without falling into a cycle of relentless judgment and condemnation? It's a hard line to walk, but maybe the answer lies in choosing compassion, in choosing to approach each other as humans first, and remembering that behind every headline, every tweet, every post is a person with a story, a life, a history, someone who, just like you and me, has made mistakes, has stumbled, and is trying to find their way. Imagine what cancel culture could look like if it were rooted in growth instead of punishment. Imagine if, instead of jumping to judgment, we asked questions, opened conversations, and gave each other the space to learn and improve. What if cancel culture wasn't about canceling people, but about calling them in, about helping each other grow into better versions of ourselves? We have a society where accountability still mattered, where harm was still acknowledged, but where we also recognize that everyone deserves a chance to make things right. That's cancel culture that doesn't just tear people down, but lifts us all up, that strengthens our community rather than dividing it, that pushes us toward a future where we're not afraid to speak, to think, to be human. So as we leave this conversation, let's hold onto that vision. Cancel culture rooted in empathy, in the idea that justice and kindness can go hand in hand. Let's remember that real change doesn't come from tearing each other apart. It comes from coming together, from understanding, from giving each other the grace to be imperfect. Because at the end of the day, we're all in this together. And if cancel culture is going to be part of our world, let's make sure it's something that serves us, that builds us, that reflects the best of who we are and the best of who we can become.